Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Welcome to another video. And might I add, another step in our Linux journey. Super excited about today's video. In our last video, I was showing you guys how I had a computer, specifically a laptop in the kitchen, and that laptop was running a distribution of Linux, and that distribution of Linux happened to be RHEL. And one of the really cool things that we were able to do was we were able to remotely control that computer, and we did that using SSH, and we did that from right here in the office. And that is really awesome because it's one of the amazing features that we constantly use where we're able to interact and work with computers somewhere out there in the network. And of course, it was a video specifically designed for you to learn about services. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, make sure you go ahead and watch that video, as that video specifically talks all about services, and we geared it towards an example specifically on SSH. Now, this video is going to be very, very important because it allows you to understand how we set up SSH, and more importantly, what happens in the background when you are setting up SSH. In the last video, when I was talking about services and I specifically geared it towards SSH, it was a great example to see what happens when you're able to shut down services and also start services. That was really cool. So here's one of the biggest challenges. It's sort of like the chicken and the egg, which came first. Do you set up SSH first and then work with the service to allow SSH? So that way you can, of course, be able to remotely control machines. Or do you set up the service first and then set up the SSH on the back end in order to be able to still SSH? Either way, chicken or the egg, the point is that today you're going to learn all about SSH. You're going to learn about how to generate the keys, and more importantly, what happens in the background, so that way we can interact with these machines that are out there in the network. But before we jump into today's video, make sure you give me a like for the video, as it really helps the channel grow. Thank you so much for hitting that like button. Subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications so that way you're notified whenever I upload new videos to the channel. And lastly, of course, make sure you share this video with a family member or a friend so that way they can learn all about Linux, and more importantly, how to leverage it in order to, as I always say, get that big shovel. And with that being said, let's jump into today's topic. But more importantly, let's head over to the desktop so that way we can learn all about SSH, how to set it up, and more importantly, what's happening in the background. Hey everyone, welcome back to the desktop, and let's learn all about SSH. How do we set up our keys? How does it work? There's a lot of great things that we're going to learn, so let's go ahead and get started. And before we do, I want to talk a little bit about what the environment looks like. So currently right now, I'm virtualizing RHEL 8 and also as well RHEL 9 in order to showcase how this all works. So if you guys want to see what that looks like, I will get out of full screen mode here. So as you can see here, I have RHEL 9 on the left and of course RHEL 8 on the right. And I'll be swapping back and forth between them. So we want to make sure that we at least understand, hey, these are two machines, two different operating systems that are running currently. Now, the other thing that I want you guys to understand is when I say the word client and I also say the word server. So remember, client is going to be the machine that we are currently on right now, meaning currently we're working with. And server is going to be the machine that we want to connect to that is somewhere out there in the network, aka the remote machine. First, I want to go ahead and create our SSH keys on our client machine, meaning the machine that we're working on. And I want to also as well connect to a server somewhere out there, and that's going to be our RHEL 9 box. So let's jump into it. So first things first, let me go ahead and make this full screen, which is going to be our RHEL 8 machine. Let's go ahead and bring up our terminal. And hopefully I made that big enough for you guys to see. Now guys, in order to connect to a machine, you need to have SSH keys. Now later on in the video, we'll talk about what all this means. But for now, let's focus on just actually being able to SSH into a machine. So first things first, on the client machine, which is going to be our RHEL 8 machine, let's go ahead and generate our SSH keys. And in order to do that, we use the command SSH-keygen. Now, in order to keep this video a little bit simpler, I'm just going to use all the default configurations. We're not going to jump into the details as to what you can change. You can go into the man page and see all that stuff. And remember, you use the man command in order to do that. So we're going to do man space SSH-keygen. And you can see here, there's a bunch of different options that you can pass it. There's a bunch of different things you can configure it for. But for the purpose of this video, we're gonna go ahead and keep things easy. So let's do Q for quit. Let's go up. Let's go ahead and let's get rid of this man. Now we're just gonna run SSH keygen, or should I say SSH hyphen keygen. And it tells us right here, hey, it's going to generate a public and private RSA key pair. And what file do we want to save the key? Now I want to keep everything, again, default, make it nice and easy, and we're going to save it to our home directory, which is going to be our /home/lcosta/.ssh/id_RSA. So let's hit enter on this. Now it's asking us for a passphrase. Again, in order to keep this simple, we're just going to leave it empty and we're going to hit enter. Now it's asking us to type in the same passphrase again in order to confirm. And again, we're going to keep it empty. So let's hit enter on that. And just like that, it's not too difficult. Our SSH keys were generated. And it gives us a nice little output here in order to see that the keys were generated. In order to verify, we can head over to the directory where it lives and you can see that it's there. So if I were to do an ls and we're going to copy and paste. Now, for example, those in the Linux world who don't know this, when you're working with the terminal, you can highlight, and in order to copy, you do just the highlighting part, which is what you just saw, and then in order to paste, you press the middle button and it actually pastes it for you. So a little fun fact there. So if I hit enter on this ls here, you can see that it's a valid file and that is my public key. And again, towards the end of the video, we'll talk a little bit about what a private and a public key is. So now that I have my public key on my client machine, remember that's the machine that I'm working on, and in order for me to SSH into a remote machine, and especially using passwordless login, and that's really one of the benefits of SSH, you have to make sure that you send over your public key to the server, and again, that's the remote machine. So now it's time for our next step, and our next step is to copy our public key and send it over into our server, which is the remote machine. But one thing before we do that, in order to make sure that this all works, and this goes back to our previous video on services, you have to make sure that the SSH service is running on your remote machine. And if it's not running, you'll never get this to work. So let me go ahead and get out of full screen mode for our RHEL 8 machine. Let's go to our RHEL 9, put that in full screen mode. And let's go ahead and log in. Let's bring up our terminal. So remember, this part should not be foreign to you. You should know how to check if SSH is currently running. So let's type in sudo system ctl status sshd, hit enter. And in your particular case, when you type that in, it should ask you for your sudo password. And of course, I've actually typed it before, so it just ran the command. And as you can see here, it tells me that SSH is currently running and it's active and it's listening for those connections. And this is going to be very, very important because in order to copy your keys, it actually uses SSH, the service, in order to copy them. And if this is not running, you'll never be able to copy over your keys. So keep that in mind. So now that I know that this is up and running, let's go ahead and minimize this. Let's bring our RHEL 8 machine back up, make that full screen. There's one other thing that I forgot to mention, so let's head back to our RHEL 9 machine. So let's go ahead and quit out of this. Now, in order to copy over our keys from our local machine or our client, remember that's our RHEL 8 box, over to our server, which is our RHEL 9 box, there's two things that you really need to know. Number one, you need the IP address of the machine that you want to connect to, and specifically, we're going to need the IP address of this particular RHEL 9 box. So in order to get that, we're going to use the nmcli command, and we can see here that we have an IP address of 192.168.1.28. So this is our IP address for our RHEL 9 box. And then the other thing that you're going to need to know is you're going to need to know the user that you want to connect to on the server. And so in our particular case here, my username on this machine is El Acosta, and you can see that right over here. So with the IP address in mind, and also as well the user in mind, we can head back to our RHEL 8 machine, which is supposed to be our local machine. That is going to be the machine that we're going to use in order to connect to our server, which is this RHEL 9 box. And we're going to send over the keys. That's the first step. And also as well, keep in mind, you're going to need that IP address and you're going to need the username. So let's head back now to our RHEL 8 box, which is supposed to be our local machine, and use that information in order to connect to it. So if I put full screen RHEL 8, now here's the command that we use in order to copy our keys. So we do SSH-copy ID. So let's reiterate that full command. So it's SSH-copy-ID. And then now we're supposed to give it the username. So it's going to be the username of the server. My server and my local machine, right, meaning the client, they both have El Acosta as the username. So don't get confused with that. Make sure you understand what the username is for both machines. So I'm going to say El Acosta at, and now we use the IP address of the server. So if you recall, that was 192.168.128. Here's the full command: SSH-copy-ID space the username of the server we're going to be connecting to. So that's going to be El Acosta, and then at, and then the IP address of that remote server. So it's going to be 192.168.1.28. So let's hit enter on that. And it says, hey, do you want to connect to the machine? And I'm going to say yes. Now it's asking me for the password of the user on that remote server. So keep that in mind. So we're going to put in our password now. Excellent. And here's what it says here. It says the number of keys that were added were 1. Now we can try logging into the machine by using the command that you see over here. And we do that in order to check to see that the keys were transferred over successfully. So if we do SSH El Acosta at 192.168.1.28, and what do you know? I am logged into that RHEL 9 machine using SSH and specifically passwordless logging, which is phenomenal. Right? I don't have to put in my password in order to log in. Now you may be a little bit confused and saying, well, I didn't really see much change, right? There's the username El Acosta at localhost, which is the exact same thing on my RHEL 8 box, right? So in order to prove to you that we are on the RHEL 9 box, let's say if I were to open up a new window here, bring that over, right? I can say cat etc Red Hat release. You can see here that it says, hey, this is my RHEL 8 machine, the local one that I'm on, and that's version 8.10. Now let's head over to our server, and this is the one that we're remotely connected to. If I were to do the same command, Red Hat release, you can see that I'm running RHEL 9.5, which is very, very different than my local machine. Even though I'm on this terminal locally on my RHEL 8 machine, I am connected to that RHEL 9 server that's sitting out there. And this is one of the really cool things that we can utilize in order to manage or work on those remote machines, and SSH is a phenomenal feature. Now you can do really cool things such as rebooting those machines as you saw me do in the last video. So let's go and run that example so that way you can see that. So I'm going to close out of this, file, close window, and let's focus on this particular window, which is the one that we're connected to, meaning we're connected to that remote server. Now, in order to show you guys how easy this is, right, and so that way you can actually see what is happening, I'm going to get out of full screen mode. Remember, the machine on the left over here is my RHEL 9 box. You can see that there. The one on the right here is my RHEL 8. Now we are connected to the RHEL 9 box, and that's the server, and we're connected with our client, which is RHEL 8. Remember what the difference is between server and client. I can do something like sudo reboot, and we type in the password, and just as you saw on the left hand side, it actually rebooted my machine because I was connected to it remotely, right, using SSH, which is really, really cool. And just like that, guys, there really isn't much to it. You just saw how to create your SSH keys. You just saw how to go ahead and send over those keys to another machine. And now you can work on any machine on the network out there that your heart desires. Now, here's an interesting question before we move on to what is happening on the background when it comes to SSH. Can this work across multiple distributions, right? We have here a Red Hat Enterprise Linux box, specifically RHEL 9 and RHEL 8, but can we do this across multiple different distributions? Or do we have to stick with a particular distribution from a particular vendor? Well, let's test that out. So as we bring in, here we have our Ubuntu machine and another distro that I like using. So our client machine is going to be our RHEL 8 box, which we have running back over here. And then our server is going to be our Ubuntu machine that is also running over here as well on the left. So let's go ahead and shrink this down a little bit. What are the steps again? First thing we need to do is we need to make sure that SSH is running on our server machine, because if it's never running the service, that is, you'll never be able to transfer over keys. So if I were to bring up my terminal, and let's make it full screen just to make it nice and easy for us to see. So now we can type in sudo systemctl status SSH. And what do you know? It says here that the SSH service cannot be found. So in order to showcase how important this is, let's get out of full screen mode here. And let's go over to our RHEL 8 box. And let's use the same command that we had before, which is SSH copy ID. So in this case, we want to do our username. And as you can see here, our username is Lewis. So let's go ahead to our RHEL 8 box and let's change this to Lewis at, and now we need the IP address of our server. Remember, our remote machine. So we can do nmcli. And we can see that our IP address on our server, which is our Ubuntu, is going to be 192. So if I type in 192.168.1.226, and let's make this full screen so that way we can see what we get. So let's run this. And what do you know? It says here that SSH could not connect and that the connection was refused. And this goes back to what I was telling you before. The first thing that we have to double check is our SSH service running on that remote server? So that was a good example to showcase how important it is to double check that. So let's get out of full screen mode for our RHEL 8 machine. Let's go to our Ubuntu machine and let's make this a little bigger. All right, cool. So we can quit out of here. So one of the things that we have to make sure is that, again, our SSH service is running. So I'm going to go ahead and say sudo systemctl start SSH. And so interestingly enough, I get this failed to start SSH service. So when you have a message that comes up like this, now the next question you might have to ask yourself is, do we even have SSH installed? Now, one of the commands that I like to use to check to see if we have SSH installed is the which command. So if I say which SSH, the funny thing is it says here that SSH is located under /user/bin/SSH. So now here's the conundrum. You're wondering, well, okay, according to the command, it says here that we have SSH, but we get this message here that says it failed to start the SSH service. And this is one of the interesting things that people have to realize, is that there's a difference between SSH itself and what we call SSH server. SSH allows us to go and connect to other machines that are remotely out there. But remember, we're looking to have our local machine, our client, which is our RHEL 8 box, connect to our server, the remote machine, which is this Ubuntu machine. And in order to do that, you have to have SSH server that runs on the machine, and it's listening for those incoming connections. So the problem here is that we don't have SSH server running, and we need to go ahead and install that. So let's go ahead and tackle that. Now, in the Ubuntu world, it's a little bit different than, of course, RHEL. And in order to work with packages here, instead of using DNF, which we've seen before on RHEL, we're going to be using the apt command, or apt, I guess is how you would call it. So I'm going to do sudo apt install, and we're going to call this open SSH server, and hit enter on this. And it's going to ask us if we want to install it. I'm going to say yes. With Open SSH Server currently installed on our Ubuntu machine, which is going to be, again, our server, our remote machine, we can go ahead now and check the status of that. So let's do a sudo systemctl status SSH. And what do you know, we have our SSH service actually running now. So when you install it, it automatically went and started the service for us, which is really cool. Now that we know that this is currently running, let's head back to our RHEL 8 box, which is going to be our local machine. Let's go ahead and make this full screen. Now we can go back to our previous command, which was the ssh-copy-id username, which was Lewis, and then of course the IP address of that server, and specifically our Ubuntu server, which was 192.168.1.226. Let's go ahead and enter on that. And it's asking us, do we want to connect? I'm going to say yes. Now it's asking us for our password for that remote server. So let's go ahead and put in our password. And it says here it added the keys. Excellent. So now if I were to go ahead and do SSH Lewis at 192.168.1.226, which is our Ubuntu server, what do you know? I'm actually in the Ubuntu server. Like, how awesome is this? It even changed my terminal here, which is really, really cool. I can see the same color scheme. So if I were to do an ls, you can see all the different directories and files that live on that remote server. Also, just to even verify that we're connected to that remote machine, we can do a cat etc issue. And look at that. How awesome is that? You see that my version that I'm running right now is Ubuntu 22.04.5 LTS. Now let's go ahead and minimize this full screen here. And of course we have our Ubuntu machine on the left, we have our RHEL 8 box on the right. So if I were to do a sudo reboot, and let's type in our password, how awesome is that? We were able to copy our SSH keys over to our Ubuntu server, and we proved that this technology, meaning using SSH to remote and control any computer out there on the network, is Linux distribution agnostic, meaning that you don't have to use it for a specific distro. I can be on a RHEL 8 box and control an Ubuntu machine out there in the network, vice versa. And the same goes out for a lot of other distributions. You can use Kali Linux, you can use Linux Mint. I mean, the list goes on and on. And this was a really cool way of seeing how we set up SSH between machines. Now let's go ahead and jump into what is actually happening in the background so you can understand what is really going on when you go through this process. So welcome to our board, and we're going to talk all about how SSH works. And remember, we're going to keep this as simple as possible. And please, guys, don't kill me in the comments about my drawing. I'm going to do my best. Remember, we are working on a computer, so it's not as easy it is to draw stuff here. So with that being said, let's tackle this topic. So first things first, let's go ahead and draw our topology as we had before, so we remember and we can speak to what that topology was. So I will draw a box here, and this box can symbolize our RHEL 8 machine. And remember, our RHEL 8 machine, that was what we called our client. And that was the machine that basically we were locally working with. And our server, I'm going to draw another box here, and our server was RHEL 9. So we have our client, which is RHEL 8, and we have our server, which was RHEL 9. So meaning that was the machine that we're going to connect to. So now when we were on our RHEL 8 machine, the first thing that we did was, and I don't know if you recall, was SSH-keygen. When you run SSH keygen on your local machine, two things happen. So a public key gets generated, and then you also have what is called a private key. So you have these two keys that gets generated, and one is going to be the public key and one is the private key, as we just mentioned. So the public key is the one that you can share. You can share that with everybody. It doesn't matter. You can share that to whomever you want. Remember, you can go check these keys out in the directory that was created, but your public key looks something like this, ID RSA dot pub. So remember, we have our ID underscore RSA dot pub. Let's head over to our rel 8 box to see that. So here is our rel 8 box. So if we were to cd into our home directory and look for .ssh, remember that is a hidden directory and this is where our SSH keys live. So let's head in here, let's do an ls. And there it is. You can see the two keys. You can see the ID underscore RSA dot pub, and you can see the ID underscore RSA. So let's head back to the whiteboard and talk a little bit about that. So as you guys just saw, you also saw our private key. So our private key was called ID underscore RSA. So keep in mind, guys, ID underscore RSA dot pub, that is your public key. And of course, you can share that with anybody your heart desires, and that can be shared out over the network. And then the private key, that is your key that is internal to you, that has your secret, that has to stay on your machine and cannot be shared with anybody whatsoever. And that is called ID underscore RSA. The second step in the process is we have to copy our public key onto the remote server. So copy public key to remote server. And remember, we use the SSH dash copy dash ID command in order to do that. Now that public key that sits on your local machine, and remember that local machine for us, the client, was our rel 8 box. It takes that public key that's on that local machine and it sends it over to our remote server, and it sends it over to our rel 9 box, which is what we did earlier in the video, and it stores it in a specific location. So if we say here that our rel 8, we can say rel 9 SSH copy. Now you see here that we have our rel 8 box, which is our local machine, and it's sending the public key over to our rel 9 box using that SSH copy ID command. And then when that transfer happens, our public key is stored on our rel 9 box, and it's stored in a specific location. And what is that location? Well, for the remote server, you have our home /.ssh /authorized underscore keys. So to reiterate real quick what's happening, when we type on the terminal SSH copy ID and we're trying to send over our public key over to our rel 9 box, it does that and it sets that public key for our rel 8 machine over in the authorized keys file. And this tells us what machines are authorized to log into this remote server. So let's take a look at that just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So remember, on the right hand side we have our rel 8, on the left we have our rel 9. Right hand side is our local machine or our client. On the left we have our rel 9, which is our server. So you now see that our ID underscore RSA public key had to be copied over to the server machine. So if we were to do a cat ID underscore RSA dot pub, this is our public key that got sent over to our rel 9 box. Now let's take a look at that directory to make sure that it's there. So if I were to do a cd home /ssh, right, we have a file in there called authorized keys. So if we were to take a look at cat authorized keys, well, what do you know? That is the same exact public key that is on our rel 8 machine. It's on our rel 9 machine, and specifically in the file called authorized underscore keys. So whenever we establish that connection, it will check to see if the key exists, and if it does, it'll allow us in. Let's head back to the whiteboard now that you've seen these keys actually exist on both machines. So now the third step in the process is connecting to the server. So now we're connecting to our server machine. And so when we do SSH on our rel 8 box and we point it to our rel 9 box, so the first thing that the rel 9 box is going to say, it's going to say, hey, let me check if key is in auth file. So the first thing that it's going to do is going to check to see if the public key is in the authorized keys file. And we see that it's up here. This is where it goes to check to see if that public key is in the authorizations underscore keys file. So here's the second thing that it's going to do. It's going to generate a challenge message. And this message is going to be generated using the public key. So now, once that challenge message is generated, it sends it back to our rel 8 machine, and we can do an M for message. Now the next step in that process is called client authentication. So that rel 8 box now is going to take the message, and we can use the M. So that challenge message that it received from the server, we're going to take that message, and it's denoted by this M here. We're going to do a plus here because we're going to utilize the ID underscore RSA. So remember, this is going to be the private key. So it's going to take the message that it received, the challenge message, plus it's going to take its private key, and it's going to combine the two, and it's going to do what's called decryption, or we'll call it short for decrypt, and it's going to decrypt the challenge message using that private key. Now, once this happens, the last step, and we'll say number 5, we'll call it granting access. Now, in the granting access phase, our rel 8 box, right, we'll denote that by an 8, and our rel 9 box, remember, this is going to be our client, and this is going to be our server. Our rel 8 box is going to send a message of that decrypted message, or that decrypted challenge message, right? It's going to respond to that challenge message and send it back to the server and say, hey, here is your answer. And if the answer is A-OK, then we're going to allow the connection. And that's if the message is OK, meaning you passed. And if you didn't pass, we're going to block, and I'll just use these double quotes for connection, and we can say not OK. And that, in a nutshell, is exactly what's happening when you are using SSH. It literally goes through these 5 steps. Now, for those who don't know, this is what we call asymmetric encryption, or sometimes you'll hear asymmetric cryptography. And what does this mean? It means that you have one key in order to encrypt and only one key in order to decrypt. So now that we know that the private key never leaves the client and the public key can be shared with everybody, so even if your public key gets compromised where it was sent to somebody that you didn't intend to send to, that still doesn't matter, because without your private key, you can never have authentication. And this is the gist of what is happening when you're using SSH. So welcome back, guys. Love to see that you made it this far. And by now, you guys should have a really good understanding of SSH in general. So meaning, what is SSH? How do we set up our keys? And also as well, if you made it this far, you should understand what happens in the background as well, which is all very, very important topics as you continue your Linux journey. Now, keep in mind, guys, one of the biggest things that I always tell you, and I say it in every video, is that practice makes perfect. I know this seems like a lot if this is your first time actually understanding what this is, but just keep going, keep practicing, and all of this will come natural, as it did for me. And again, it took me a while to get here, so don't beat yourself up if you don't understand the concepts. Just run the video again, keep practicing, and I guarantee you, you'll get it in no time. So that'll do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for coming back to the channel. And more importantly, thank you for sharing all the information that we are learning as we continue our journey. So if this content has really helped you out, make sure you give me a like for the video, as it really helps the channel grow. Subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications so that way you're notified whenever I upload new videos to the channel. And of course, share this with a family member or friend so that way they can understand the concepts that we learned today. And more importantly, you might introduce them to something new that they haven't learned before. So thanks for watching, guys. Love you all. I really appreciate you. And I'll see everybody in the next one.